It is 1964. In a Pretoria courtroom, a black man in a suit tells the white judges he is prepared to die. He has already confessed to sabotage. The state wants him hanged. He speaks for 4 hours, explaining why he built bombs. The judges retire to deliberate. They will not hang him. They will do something worse. They will try to make him disappear. Tonight, we unravel the life of Nelson Mandela, the man who spent 27 years in prison and walked out to lead the country that had caged him. He entered as a saboteur. He emerged as a saint. But the path between those 2 points was stranger and harder than the legend allows. How did this happen? How did a chief's son from a remote village become the most famous prisoner on earth? And how did a man who had planned bombings become the symbol of reconciliation, shaking hands with the men who had kept him locked away? Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. In tonight's episode, we'll trace how a boy named Rolihlahla, which means troublemaker, grew into the man the world would call the father of a nation. We'll walk with him from the green hills of the Transkei to the lime quarry of Robben Island, from the sabotage headquarters at Rivonia to the presidential palace in Pretoria. Along the way, we'll meet the women he loved and failed, the comrades he led and sometimes disappointed, and the enemies he slowly, painstakingly turned into partners. So settle in now, as we begin to explore the life of the prisoner who became a president and the revolutionary who learned that the hardest battles are fought without weapons. This is the Bedtime biography of Nelson Mandela. Chapter 1: The Runaway Prince. The story begins in 1918 in a village called Mveso, tucked into the rolling green hills of the Transkei in South Africa. A boy was born to a councillor of the Thembu royal house, a man of standing with 4 wives and 13 children, and cattle enough that milk was always plentiful in the kraal. They named the child Rolihlahla. In the Xhosa language, it means something like troublemaker. His father, Henry Gadla Mpakanyiswa, served as an advisor to the Thembu king. He was wealthy by the standards of the region, respected by his peers, but that world could be undone by small things. A dispute arose with a white magistrate over the jurisdiction of an ox. The father refused to appear before the colonial court, and for this defiance, he lost everything: his position, his land, his cattle. The family moved to Kunu, a smaller village, where the boy would spend his early years herding sheep and playing in the streams. On his first day of school, his teacher, Mrs. Madingane, gave him a new name: Nelson. This was simply how things worked in the colonial education system. African names were set aside, replaced with English ones, as if the child were being issued a uniform. He accepted it without question. Most children did. When Nelson was 9, his father died of tuberculosis. Years later, he would describe feeling not grief exactly, but something more like being cut adrift. A rope had been severed. His mother took him on a long walk away from Kunu to a place called Mkhekezweni, the Great Place. It was the seat of the Thembu regent, Jongintaba Dalindiebo, who had agreed to raise the boy as his ward. The Great Place was a different world entirely. The regent drove a Ford V8. His wife, no England, presided over a household that was both traditional and westernized, where Christianity and Thembu custom existed side by side. Young Nelson was given the same education as the regent's own son, Justice. He wore European clothes. He attended church. He watched power being exercised up close. At tribal meetings, the regent would sit and listen as his councillors spoke one by one. He never interrupted. He let every voice be heard, even the dissenting ones, before he summarized the consensus of the group. Nelson sat in on these gatherings, absorbing the rhythms of debate. He later called it democracy in its purest form. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain early access to episodes, direct voting rights on future topics, and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Now, back to the story. At 16, he underwent the traditional Xhosa initiation rite of circumcision. The pain was severe, the surgery crude. He felt ashamed for flinching, but there was a ceremony afterward, and speeches, and one of them lodged in his memory like a splinter. Chief Melekili stood before the initiates and told them the truth as he saw it. "We are a conquered people," he said. "We are slaves in our own country." These young men would cough their lungs out in the bowels of the white man's mines so that the white man could live a life of unequaled prosperity. The other elders shifted uncomfortably. Nelson received his initiation name, Dale Bunga, meaning Maker of Parliaments. It was meant to signal his destiny as a counselor to kings. He was sent to elite Methodist boarding schools, first Clarkbury, then Healdtown. The curriculum was English. The staff were largely British expatriates. He learned Latin and literature. He learned to box. He absorbed Victorian values of etiquette and emotional restraint. He confessed later to being something of an Anglophile, viewing the Englishman as the very model of a gentleman. He became a prefect. Once, he leaped onto a dining hall table to lecture his fellow students on proper behavior. In 1939, he enrolled at Fort Hare University, wearing his first suit. His ambition was modest by most standards. He wanted to become a court interpreter, a respectable position in the rural civil service. He met Oliver Tambo there, and they taught Sunday school together. He was conscious of his own dignity, sensitive to insult or patronage. Then came a dispute over food. Students boycotted the Student Representative Council elections in protest. Nelson was elected anyway, but he refused to take his seat, standing in solidarity with the boycott. The principal, Dr. Kerr, gave him an ultimatum: serve on the council or be expelled. He chose expulsion. He returned to the Great Place where the regent was furious. "Go back," the regent demanded. "Apologize. Take your seat. Finish your degree." Instead, the regent announced he had arranged marriages for both Nelson and Justice. The two young men looked at each other and made a decision. They would run. They stole 2 of the regent's oxen and sold them to a local trader for train fare. In 1941, Nelson boarded a train for Johannesburg, leaving behind the green hills of the Transkei and the gilded certainties of the great place. He believed he was escaping the constraints of tradition for the freedom of the city. He did not yet understand what awaited him there. Chapter 2. The Johannesburg Hustle. Johannesburg in 1941 was a city built on gold and held together by desperation. They called it Egoli, the place of gold, and men came from across the subcontinent to find their fortune in its depths. What they found instead were compounds and curfews, pass books, and police raids. Into this world stepped a young runaway from the Transkei, carrying little more than his aristocratic bearing and the clothes on his back. He found work as a night watchman at Crown Mines. The uniform was standard issue. The knobkerry was heavy in his hand. He patrolled the perimeter of the compound where thousands of miners slept in concrete bunks, far from their families, their wages sent home to villages they might not see for years. For a Thembu aristocrat raised in the great place, it was a particular kind of humiliation. He had grown up watching elders debate matters of justice beneath open skies. Now he guarded other men's gold through the small hours of the night. The job didn't last. The regent sent a telegram to the mine authorities demanding his return, and just like that, he was out. He drifted to Alexandra Township, a place the locals called Dark City because the government had never bothered to wire it for electricity. He rented a single room in someone's backyard, slept on the floor, used a bucket for a toilet. The rent was almost impossible to pay. Years later, he would describe it simply a home where he did not have a house. It was in Alexandra that he met Walter Sisulu. Sisulu was an estate agent, which in those days meant navigating the Byzantine restrictions on where black South Africans could live and own property. He was also an ANC man, well-connected, sharp-eyed, and always looking for talent. He saw something in the young runaway from the countryside. Great qualities, he called it. Immense potential. Sisulu became mentor, financier, and brother all at once. Through Sisulu's connections, he landed a position as an articled clerk at Witkin, Sadelsky and Eidelman, a white law firm in the city. The pay was £2 a month, barely enough to survive on, but it came with something more valuable, the chance to study law part-time at the University of the Witwatersrand. He enrolled as the only black student in his year. Some professors treated him as a curiosity. Others, like H.R. Harlow, told him plainly that Africans were unsuited for the profession. The law firm offered its own education. A white senior typist approached him one day with what she clearly considered a generous explanation. "Look, Nelson," she said, "we have no color bar here." Then she instructed him to take his tea from the tea boy in the passage, so he wouldn't break the crockery reserved for whites. Another secretary handed him sixpence and asked him to buy her shampoo, treating the articled clerk as an errand boy because of his skin. But there were other voices too. Gao Radebe worked at the same firm, a confident man who belonged to both the ANC and the Communist Party. He told the young clerk to stop trying to be a black Englishman. Nat Bregman, a white colleague, shared his sandwiches and invited him to multiracial parties where people argued about politics until late in the night. These friendships cracked open something that his rural upbringing had sealed shut. Not all whites were the same. Some of them were willing to share more than just their lunch. In 1944, he married Evelyn Mays, a nurse and Sisulu's cousin. They moved into a small rented house at 8115 Orlando West in the township that would later be called Soweto. Domestic life meant carrying water from communal taps and navigating streets where gangs operated freely after dark. And yet he remained fastidious about his appearance, ordering suits from Markham's, maintaining the bearing of a man who expected to be taken seriously. The debts piled up. He borrowed money from the Bantu Welfare Trust just to pay his university fees. He failed his exams repeatedly, but in 1952, after years of grinding study between court appearances and political meetings, he finally qualified as an attorney. He opened Mandela and Tambo with his friend Oliver, the first African-run law firm in the country. The waiting room was always full. Men and women came with their passbook troubles, their eviction notices, their harassment by police. He had become a notable, a man of status in a community that had precious few advocates. By then, the ANC had already claimed him. He had joined in 1944, introduced by Sisulu and Radebe, and had fallen under the spell of Anton Lembede. Lembede was a fiery Africanist who argued that black people must liberate themselves without relying on white communists or Indian liberals. His philosophy burned bright and hot. The young lawyer absorbed it eagerly and helped found the ANC Youth League that same year. Their aim was to overthrow the conservative old guard who still believed in petitions and polite deputations. His temperament in those days ran hot. He once stormed a Communist Party meeting, shouting down the speakers, physically pulling them from the stage. Foreign ideologies, he believed, were diluting the African struggle. And yet when James Mpanza, the so-called King of Orlando who led squatter movements against the housing shortage, needed a lawyer, he took the case. Ideology was one thing, practical solidarity was another. The young lawyer in the sharp suit had learned to navigate the white world. He could argue in their courts and charm their secretaries, but the courtroom victories felt hollow when the laws themselves were designed to crush black aspiration. The intellectual debates of the Youth League were about to collide with something harder, a new government that had plans of its own. The man about town would soon have to choose between his legal gown and something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Young Lion. In 1948, the National Party won an election on a single promise: apartheid. The word meant separateness in Afrikaans, though what it promised was something closer to a blueprint for permanent subjugation. Mandela was stunned. His friend Oliver Tambo put it more coldly. Now we will know exactly who our enemies are. The old guard of the ANC had spent decades writing polite letters to the government, requesting meetings that never came. Mandela and the Youth League had run out of patience. In 1949, they forced the removal of the moderate President Zuma and installed leaders willing to fight strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience. The program of action wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of intent. And yet Mandela remained suspicious of allies. When communists organized a May Day strike in 1950, he refused to support it. He argued that the struggle belonged to Africans alone. "There are two bulls in this kraal," he said, "a black bull and a white bull. The black bull must rule." He was young, certain, and about to be proven wrong. On the 1st of May, police opened fire on the strikers. 18 people died in the streets. Mandela watched the aftermath. He saw the discipline of the communist organizers, how they held their lines even as the bullets flew. Something shifted in him that day. He began reading Marx. He spent long nights debating with Moses Kotane, the Communist Party secretary. By the end, he had accepted a harder truth. The ANC needed allies, Indians, communists, anyone willing to stand against the state. In 1952, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign. Thousands of volunteers would deliberately break apartheid laws and accept arrest. Mandela was appointed National Volunteer-in-Chief. He drove across the country in a borrowed car, organizing branches, giving speeches, recruiting. In Durban, 10,000 people gathered to hear him speak. He was, by his own admission, bowled over. He was arrested on the first day of the campaign, June 26th. They put him in a cell with Yusuf Kachalia. A sympathetic white warder broke regulations and let them share a cell for the night. Small mercies in a system designed to grind people down. The campaign eventually collapsed after riots in the Eastern Cape gave the government an excuse to crack down. But something unexpected had happened. ANC membership exploded from a few thousand to 100,000. Mandela had become a national figure. His name was chanted at rallies. His face appeared in newspapers. The government responded by banning him. He was forbidden from attending meetings, forbidden from leaving Johannesburg, forbidden from speaking in public. They wanted him silent and contained. Instead, he went underground. In 1953, he drafted the M Plan. The M stood for Mandela. It was a blueprint for survival. The ANC would be reorganized into small, secret street cells, zones and wards. When the inevitable ban came, the organization would already be invisible, already embedded in the townships like roots beneath concrete. That same year, at a meeting in Sophiatown, he said something that made the room go quiet. The time for passive resistance had ended. He was floating the idea of violence years before the ANC officially turned to armed struggle. People shifted in their seats. Some nodded, others looked away. In 1955, thousands gathered at Kliptown for the Congress of the People. Mandela watched from the fringes, disguised as a laborer because of his banning order. On the platform, delegates adopted the Freedom Charter. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It was a definitive break from his earlier exclusive Africanism. He had changed. Police armed with Sten guns stormed the platform and confiscated documents. The delegates sang freedom songs as they were searched. In December 1956, police arrived at his door before dawn. He was arrested along with 155 others and charged with high treason. The trial dragged on for 4 years. Daily bus rides to Pretoria became a kind of routine. In the courtroom, Mandela was aggressive, confident. He treated the white prosecutors as equals or inferiors. He raised his fist in salute. He was building a repertoire. His marriage to Evelyn did not survive the pressure. She moved out in 1957, taking the furniture and the children. Mandela came home to an empty house. He met Winnie Madikizela at a bus stop. She was 22, beautiful, and training to be a social worker. He invited her to lunch at an Indian restaurant called Capitan's. The courtship was rapid. He bought her a wedding dress before he had even proposed. They married in 1958 in the Transkei during a brief recess from the trial. Police arrived at the wedding festivities, a reminder that even happiness was provisional. In March 1960, police opened fire on demonstrators at Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The government declared a state of emergency and banned the ANC outright. Mandela was detained for months. When he was finally released, the organization he had helped build no longer legally existed. The lawyer's office was closed. The family home was quiet. The suit had been traded for a disguise. The era of petitions and placards had ended in gunfire. And somewhere in the shadows, a man the newspapers would soon call the Black Pimpernel began to move, carrying a dangerous idea that would change everything. Chapter 4. The Spear is Sharpened. The night of March 21st, 1960, found Mandela in a place he was not supposed to be. Joe Slovo's house sat in a white suburb of Johannesburg, and black men were not permitted there after dark. But the police were busy elsewhere that evening. In Sharpeville, 69 people lay dead in the dust, shot in the back as they fled from a protest against the past laws. The news came through in fragments. Walter Sisulu was there. So were others from the movement's inner circle. They sat in Slovo's living room, smoking, talking, trying to understand what had just happened to their country. A week later, Mandela stood in Orlando with a group of press photographers watching him. He held his passbook, that hated document that every black South African was required to carry, and set it on fire. The flames caught quickly. Cameras clicked. This was not a private gesture of defiance. He wanted the whole country to see. 2 days after that, the police came for him. A sympathetic officer in the special branch had tipped him off, but it made no difference. Under the new state of emergency regulations, they could arrest anyone they liked. He spent 5 months in Pretoria local prison, watching the movement he had helped build get dismantled from the outside. When he emerged in August, the ANC was banned. The organization that had fought for African rights since 1912 was now illegal. Mandela was appointed to a small national working committee tasked with an almost impossible job. They had to take a mass movement and rebuild it in the shadows. In March of 1961, his banning orders expired. For a brief window, he could appear in public. He chose Pietermaritzburg, where 1,400 delegates had gathered for an all-in-Africa conference. Nobody knew he was coming. He walked onto the stage unannounced, and the room erupted. He demanded that the government call a national convention to write a new constitution. He knew they would refuse. That was the point. He went underground immediately after. There was no proper goodbye with Winnie. Joe Modiz pulled up in a car, and Mandela got in while she stood there packing a suitcase he would not be taking. He told her nothing about where he was going or when he might return. The safe houses blurred together. One was a flat in Yeovil belonging to Wolfie Kodesh. Mandela slept on a camp bed and skipped rope to keep fit. He disguised himself as a chauffeur, a gardener, a chef. The newspapers started calling him the Black Pimpernel, after the fictional hero who evaded capture during the French Revolution. He enjoyed the comparison. Sometimes he would telephone newsrooms just to prove he was still free. In May, he organized a national stay-at-home strike to protest the declaration of South Africa as a republic. The state responded with tanks in the townships. He called off the strike on the second day. There was no sense in getting more people killed. He told a British television reporter afterward that if the government crushed peaceful demonstrations with naked force, the movement would have to reconsider its tactics. This was not a threat made lightly. In June, he argued for the adoption of violence at a meeting of the National Working Committee. Moses Kotane opposed him fiercely, fearing the repression it would bring. Mandela spent an entire day persuading him. He traveled to Stanger in Natal to see Chief Albert Lutherly, the ANC president and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Lutherly was a man of principle, deeply committed to non-violence. Mandela asked for his blessing to form a separate military wing. Lutherly was reluctant. Eventually, he conceded. The organization was called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. Mandela and Slovo drafted the Constitution and Manifesto together. They decided on sabotage as the opening tactic. It would damage infrastructure without killing people. It would scare away foreign investment. And it would leave the door open for negotiation if the government ever came to its senses. Mandela moved to Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, posing as a gardener named David. He wore blue overalls and lived in a thatched cottage on the property. At night, he read Clausewitz on war. He studied the memoirs of Boer, generals who had fought the British 60 years earlier. He was looking for patterns, strategies, anything that might be useful. The military preparations were amateurish. He practiced shooting with an air rifle. He helped make primitive bombs from chemicals and industrial explosives. One night, he went with Jack Hodgson and Joe Slovo to test an explosion at an abandoned brickworks. An elderly night watchman heard the noise. Mandela had to talk him out of calling the police. On December 16, 1961, the first MK attacks struck power stations and government offices across the country. Mandela was not directly involved in the operations, but he issued the manifesto. It said that the time comes in the life of any nation when there remain only two choices: submit or fight. He never believed they could defeat the South African military. The sabotage campaign was designed to frighten foreign investors and force the government to negotiate. It was a political strategy dressed in military clothing. He recruited Joe Modise and others into a high command. They studied maps of the country's infrastructure, looking for vulnerable points, power lines, rail links, anything that would make the economy bleed. By early 1962, Mandela was preparing to leave South Africa entirely. Homemade bombs were not enough. He needed money and guns and international support. That meant traveling to independent African states, meeting their leaders, asking for help. It meant slipping across the border illegally, leaving behind his wife and children and soldiers. Chapter 5. The Black Pimpernel. On January the 10th, 1962, a man in a safari suit crossed the border into Bechuanaland under the afternoon sun. He carried a suitcase, a false passport, and a new name, David Motsamai. The mosquito boots were practical. The alias was borrowed from a friend, and Nelson Mandela, commander of an army that existed mostly on paper, was finally outside South Africa for the first time in his life. The destination was Ethiopia, where a conference of African freedom movements was gathering in Addis Ababa, but first came Dar es Salaam and a meeting with Julius Nyerere, the philosopher-president of Tanganyika. They disagreed almost immediately. Nyerere believed African society was inherently socialist, that communal traditions made Western ideological debates irrelevant. Mandela pushed back. He saw a more complicated picture, one where different ideas might coexist. Neither man convinced the other. They parted on friendly terms. At the conference itself, Mandela caused a small sensation. He stood before the delegates and made an argument that some found startling. Arabs, he said, could also be Africans. It was a strategic move, meant to bridge the divide between North and Sub-Saharan Africa to build a broader coalition. Some applauded, others were less sure, but people remembered him. Then began the tour. 13 heads of state in a matter of months. He traveled from capital to capital with a single purpose: weapons and money for MK. President Bourguiba of Tunisia gave him £5,000. Senegal and Guinea promised support. He was no longer a lawyer from Johannesburg. He was a diplomat without a country, making the case for revolution in presidential offices across a continent. In Morocco, he visited the headquarters of the Algerian FLN, the guerrillas who had fought the French to a standstill. These were men who understood armed struggle in ways Mandela was only beginning to grasp. They gave him military instruction and hard advice. A revolution cannot move with two heads, they told him. Political education matters more than pure militarism. He listened carefully. By June, he had reached London. He met opposition leaders like Hugh Gaitskell and Dennis Healey. He charmed David Astor, the editor of The Observer, who helped raise his profile in the British press. He was learning a different kind of warfare here, the kind fought in newspaper columns and parliamentary corridors. And in the evenings, he reunited with Oliver Tambo, his old law partner, now running the ANC in exile. They spent long hours together, He also visited Todd Matshikiza, a musician friend from the old days. Matshikiza's wife looked at Mandela and sensed something unsettling. He seemed to her like a man leaving them ready for martyrdom. He returned to Ethiopia in late June for proper military training. Lieutenant Befekidu taught him demolition, field craft, how to handle automatic weapons. He was 43 years old, learning to be a soldier. But the course was cut short after only 2 weeks. A telegram arrived from Walter Sisulu. "Come back." The movement was in disarray. Rumors were spreading that Mandela had abandoned the struggle. He drove through the night from the border, arriving at Liliesleaf Farm in July. In his suitcase were cotton prints from the countries he had visited, gifts for Winnie. He also brought a semi-automatic pistol, a present from the Ethiopians. He buried the gun and his military uniform in the ground at Liliesleaf. They were never recovered. His report to the ANC Working Committee was blunt, even harsh. The movement's image abroad was poor. Too many foreign observers believed the ANC was dominated by white communists. They needed to project a more authentic African leadership. Not everyone wanted to hear it. Despite the danger, he insisted on traveling to Natal to brief Chief Luthuli personally. Cecil Williams, a white theatre director and communist, drove him down. Mandela wore his khaki drill uniform from Ethiopia, abandoning his usual caution. He attended a party at a journalist's house in Durban and spoke openly about guerrilla warfare. After 17 months underground, he had grown careless. On August the 5th, 1962, the net closed. Mandela was driving back to Johannesburg disguised as a chauffeur when police flagged down the car outside Howick. He tried to hide his loaded revolver and notebook between the seats, but there was no time. Sergeant Vorster recognized him immediately. He surrendered with dignity. "I am Nelson Mandela," he said, and his time on the run was over. At Pietermaritzburg prison, they stripped him of his chauffeur's uniform and put him in a cell. His captors treated him with a strange mixture of triumph and something approaching respect. They let him walk unhandcuffed to the toilet, but the police understood what they had caught. In his possession was a diary detailing his meetings with African heads of state. Evidence enough to hang the movement. Chapter 6. The Trial of the Century. The Fort prison in Johannesburg allowed Mandela weekly visits from Winnie. Officials would look away as they embraced, granting them a few stolen moments of warmth in an otherwise cold and indifferent place. The British ambassador, meanwhile, sent history books to his cell. A memo in the diplomatic files noted that helping Mandela might, in the long run, generate some goodwill for Britain. Even empires hedge their bets. Joe Slovo and Joe Modise came to him with an escape plan. They had bribed a policeman who would unlock the courtroom cells during the lunch recess. Mandela listened carefully, then handed the plans back. He asked Slovo to destroy them. He had decided that his trial would be his stage, and he intended to use it. On the 13th of October, 1962, he entered the Pretoria court wearing a traditional leopard skin kaross, the ceremonial costume of Xhosa royalty. The garment was a provocation and a statement. He was not a defendant begging for mercy. He was a prince putting the state itself on trial. Winnie sat in the gallery, wearing a beaded headdress and an ankle-length hosa skirt. Police had tried to confiscate the carros before proceedings began, but she had defied them, matching her husband's theatre with her own. Outside the courthouse, a praise singer intoned Mandela's family tree, while crowds chanted, "Amandla, Ngawetu, power to the people." The words rolled through the streets of Pretoria like distant thunder. He conducted his own defense. He applied for the magistrate's recusal, arguing that he was not morally bound to obey laws made by a parliament in which he had no representation. He asked the court a simple question: why is it that in this courtroom I am facing a white magistrate, confronted by a white prosecutor, escorted by white orderlies? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no answer that would not indict the system itself. He cross-examined the Prime Minister's secretary, a man named Barnard. He pressed him until Barnard admitted that ignoring Mandela's letter demanding a national convention would be considered scandalous in any civilized country. The admission was a small victory, but Mandela collected small victories like coins, knowing they would eventually add up to something larger. On the 7th of November, he delivered a plea in mitigation. It was less a legal argument than a political testament. He spoke of his childhood, of listening to elders tell stories of ancestors who had defended the fatherland against colonial invasion. He told the court that no man in his right senses would voluntarily choose such a life in preference to one of normal family and social existence. He was not apologizing, he was explaining. The court sentenced him to 5 years for incitement and leaving the country illegally. He turned to face the gallery and raised his fist in the clenched salute. The gesture would be repeated by political prisoners for decades to come. At Pretoria local prison, guards stripped him naked. The leopard skin was bundled away, and he was issued the standard uniform of short pants, the clothing assigned to African prisoners as a mark of their supposed inferiority. He refused to wear them. He refused to eat the cold mealy porridge they gave him. He was placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with only 30 minutes of exercise. Eventually, he requested transfer to the general cells. He wanted to be with the other prisoners, including Robert Sobukwe, the leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress. Then came Rivonia. In July of 1963, police raided Liliesleaf Farm and captured the high command of Umkhonto we Sizwe, Sisulu, Mbeki, Kathrada, and others were taken. The police found documents, including a draft plan called Operation Maibuye and Mandela's own diary. The plan outlined guerrilla warfare involving submarine landings and 7,000 insurgents. Mandela and his co-accused would later argue it had never been officially adopted, but the state had what it needed to seek the death penalty. Mandela was brought from Robben Island to join the accused. He arrived in the Supreme Court still wearing his prison shorts and sandals, and he was disgusted by his own appearance. Bram Fisher led the defense team. The legal fees were paid by an auction in London, organized by Canon John Collins, featuring works by Picasso and Henry Moore. He chose to make a statement from the dock rather than testify. This meant he could not be cross-examined, but it also meant his words would carry less legal weight. He did not care. He spent 2 weeks writing the statement. On the 20th of April, 1964, he read it aloud for 4 hours. He admitted to forming Umkhonto we Sizwe. He denied being a communist. He spoke of his admiration for the British parliamentary system and the American Congress. Then he reached his final lines. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. He sat down. The courtroom fell silent. The silence lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like minutes. From the gallery, he heard what sounded like a great sigh, followed by the cries of women. On the 11th of June, Judge DeWitt delivered his verdict. Guilty. That night, Mandela, Sisulu, and Mbeki met and decided not to appeal. They believed that only the struggle and international solidarity could save them from the gallows, not a court that had already made up its mind. The next day, the 12th of June, 1964, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Guards hustled them out the back of the courthouse to avoid the crowds. At midnight, they were given sandwiches and soft drinks, then driven to a military airfield. The doors of the aircraft slammed shut, sealing the men inside a metal tube that lifted them away from the courtroom and the cheering crowds of Pretoria. They were flying toward a void, toward a place where their names were meant to be forgotten and their influence extinguished by the cold Atlantic wind. As the lights of the mainland faded beneath them, they were no longer political icons or soldiers. They were simply cargo, bound for a limestone rock that had broken men for centuries. Chapter 7. Island of Ghosts. The ferry crossing from Cape Town takes less than an hour. It might as well have been a voyage to another world. The prisoners huddled in the hold below deck, and above them the warders passed the time by urinating through the grates. When the boat finally docked at Robben Island, it was the dead of night, and the welcome was waiting. Dis die Island. Here, Jules Ganvrek. The warders screamed it into the darkness. This is the island. Here you will die. They meant it as a promise. The men were ordered to strip naked on the quayside. Their clothes were thrown into vats of disinfectant and returned soaking wet. They were told to dress immediately. One warder spotted a prisoner with long hair and moved toward him with his fist raised. Mandela stepped forward. He told the man, calmly, that if he touched the prisoner, he would take him to court. The commanding officer intervened before it went further. It was Mandela's first act on the island, and it set a precedent he would maintain for the next 18 years. Section B was a newly built block of single cells, separated from the general population by high walls. The cells measured roughly 6 feet by 7. A tall man could not lie down without bending his knees. There was a single window, about a foot square, set high in the wall. A sisal mat and 3 thin blankets were issued for sleeping on the concrete floor. Mandela would not sleep on a proper bed until the mid-1970s. The days were governed by bells and whistles. Wake up at 5:30, clean the cell, slop out the sanitary bucket at 6:45. Breakfast was cold maize porridge and a drink they called coffee, made from burnt corn, then work. In the early months, work meant breaking stones in the courtyard. The men sat in rows, a yard and a half apart, forbidden to speak. They wore wire masks to protect their eyes from flying chips. In January of 1965, they were moved to the lime quarry. The white glare of the limestone was blinding. The authorities refused requests for sunglasses. Over time, the damage to Mandela's tear ducts became permanent. Food was rationed according to race. As an African, Mandela received the worst portion, 12 ounces of cornmeal a day. Meat, often mostly gristle, every other day. Indian and colored prisoners received bread and larger servings. The system was designed to remind them, constantly, of their place. One of Mandela's earliest campaigns was against the short trousers. African prisoners were issued the same clothing given to schoolboys. He argued it was demeaning for grown men. The protests went on for weeks. Eventually, a pair of long trousers appeared in his cell. He refused to wear them. He waited until every man in Section B had been issued the same. The search ritual, known as the Tausa, required prisoners to strip naked, leap into the air, and bend over to expose themselves. Mandela refused to perform it. Eventually, the political section was exempted. In 1969, a telegram arrived. His eldest son, Thembi, had been killed in a car accident. Mandela requested permission to attend the funeral. It was denied. Walter Sisulu found him later that day, alone in his cell. Sisulu said nothing. He simply knelt beside Mandela's mat and held his hand until the bell rang for lockup. A duty warder observed Mandela, standing at his cell window that night. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He just stood there, staring into the dark, not moving. Winnie was banned and harassed on the mainland, unable to visit for 2 years. When she was finally permitted, they sat on opposite sides of a thick glass partition, speaking through headphones while warders listened. If they slipped into Xhosa, the line was cut. In his cell, Mandela kept a photograph of her. Every morning, he dusted the frame. He later wrote of imagining an electric current passing between them when he touched her nose in the picture. In 1966, the political prisoners joined a hunger strike in solidarity with the general section, who were protesting their rations. The strike succeeded, in part because the warders themselves began complaining about the quality of their own food. Helen Suzman, the lone anti-apartheid voice in the White Parliament, visited in 1967. She was appalled by what she saw. She raised the conditions in Parliament, and soon after, the sadistic warder known as Suitcase was removed. By 1969, things had improved slightly. Board games were permitted on Sundays. The prisoners' internal committee, the high organ, began to function more openly. The lime quarry had taken its toll on their bodies. Their eyes ached. Their lungs carried the dust, but it had failed to break them. Chapter 8. Master of the Prison. The island had its rules. The warders set them, the prisoners broke them, and somewhere in between, a different kind of order took shape, one that the authorities never sanctioned and couldn't quite see. It began in 1965, when the 4 surviving members of the ANC's National Executive Committee decided they needed a governing body. Mandela, Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond, Malaba. They called it the High Organ, and they added a rotating 5th member to keep things democratic. The warders thought they ran Section B. The High Organ knew otherwise. Then came the curriculum. The prisoners called it the university, though there were no lecture halls, no chalkboards, no degrees to confer. There was only the lime quarry, where men swung picks under the blazing sun, while Mandela drilled them on ANC history. Syllabus A covered the organization's past. Syllabus B moved into political theory. He used what he called a modified Socratic method, which meant asking questions until his students either understood or collapsed from exhaustion. The written lectures were trickier. Mandela would compose them at night, and then Lalu Chiba or Mac Maharaj would smuggle the pages to the general section in food drums hidden among the prison's thin porridge. Messages came back the same way, or folded into matchboxes, or concealed in the hollow bottoms of toilet paper rolls. The warders searched constantly. They rarely found anything. Govan Mbeki disagreed with nearly everything Mandela taught. A hardline Marxist with an unshakable faith in the revolutionary potential of rural peasants, Mbeki believed the countryside was ready to rise. Mandela looked elsewhere for his models, particularly to the Portuguese colonial wars, where guerrilla fighters had carved out bases in neighboring states. The arguments grew heated, then personal. By 1972, the 2 men had stopped speaking entirely, and the High Organ itself was temporarily dissolved. The mid-70s brought a new challenge. Young prisoners began arriving from the mainland, disciples of the Black Consciousness movement. They wore their ideology like armor and their contempt openly. To them, the ANC leaders were old men, moderates, who had compromised with white liberals and lost. They refused to defer. Some of the elder prisoners wanted confrontation. Mandela surprised them by choosing conversation instead. There was a night when the authorities screened a film called The Wild One, the one with Marlon Brando on a motorcycle. The older prisoners dismissed it as hooliganism, young men without purpose or discipline. But Mandela found himself nodding along with Srini Moodley, a young BC radical who argued that the biker rebellion represented something real, a generational revolt against inherited authority. It was an unexpected alignment. It opened doors. Harry Gwala was harder to reach. A fiery communist housed in the general section, Gwala preached the seizure of power to anyone who would listen. After the 1976 Soweto uprising, waves of angry teenagers flooded the island, and many of them gravitated toward his militancy. They called themselves the Soweto generation, and they wanted war. Kathrada later recalled how Mandela would bring the polemics down to earth, reminding the hotheads that Umkhonto we Sizwe had never been designed to defeat the South African army in open battle. The point was to force negotiations. The point was to survive long enough to win. Meanwhile, Mandela was working on the warders. He learned Afrikaans, the better to understand their culture and their grievances. He asked about their families. He listened when they talked. One warder named James Gregory arrived in 1967 as Mandela's censor and gradually became something closer to a friend. Mandela understood that Gregory needed connection, and he provided it, gently exploiting the relationship to smuggle small comforts like chocolate out to Winnie. By 1980, some warders were asking Mandela to help them draft their promotion essays. He won the right to cultivate a garden in the courtyard. He studied horticulture with the same intensity he brought to political economy, and eventually he was harvesting 2,000 chilies, 1,000 tomatoes, and watermelons fat enough to share. He gave the produce to the warders. They accepted it. The transaction built a kind of capital that couldn't be counted in money. In 1975, he began writing his autobiography in secret, working at night or pretending to be sick so he could stay in his cell. The manuscript ran to 500 pages. Chiba transcribed it into microscopic script, and Maharaj smuggled it out concealed in a photo album. But they had also buried the original in the courtyard, wrapped in plastic containers, and during construction work the warders dug it up. The punishment was severe. Mandela, Sisulu, and Kathrada lost their study privileges for 4 years. He read War and Peace during those years and found himself identifying with General Kutuzov, the Russian commander who defeated Napoleon through patience rather than brilliance, through knowing his people rather than outmaneuvering his enemies. The Soweto teenagers who arrived after '76 looked at Mandela strangely. To them he was not just a prisoner or a leader. He was a myth, a name from a history they had been forbidden to learn. And here he was, tending tomatoes, debating strategy, converting warders one conversation at a time. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that when a new commanding officer tried to reassert discipline, Mandela simply negotiated a deal. The prisoners would appear to work. In exchange, they would be left alone. Everyone understood who was really in charge. Chapter 9. The Myth and the Wife. In 1977, the South African government loaded Winnie Mandela into a vehicle and drove her hundreds of miles from Johannesburg. They deposited her in Brandfort, a conservative Afrikaner town in the Free State, in a small house without running water. The township was called Fathakele, handle with care. The authorities believed they were burying her. They had miscalculated badly. Within months, Winnie had befriended a local white attorney named Pied de Waal and his wife Adele, who lent her books and let her use their bathroom. She transformed her exile into a center of resistance, receiving visitors, giving interviews, refusing to disappear. The government had hoped to silence her. Instead, they had given her a stage. Meanwhile, her husband was becoming something other than a man. In 1980, Percy Kwaboza, editor of the World newspaper, launched the Free Mandela campaign. The strategy was deliberate. Instead of fighting for abstract principles, they would fight for a person, a face, a name, and it worked beyond anyone's expectations. By 1988, 250,000 people gathered at Wembley Stadium in London for a concert in his honor. Dutch admirers alone sent 170,000 birthday cards to the prison service. He had become the world's most famous prisoner, a living symbol of resistance, a secular saint whose face appeared on T-shirts and posters from Tokyo to New York. Most of these people had never heard him speak. Many couldn't have found South Africa on a map. It didn't matter. The myth had taken on a life of its own. Winnie filled the void left by American civil rights martyrs. The international media cast her as the authentic African queen, dignified and suffering. At a church in Harlem, Betty Shabazz, the widow of Malcolm X, introduced her to the congregation. "There must be a God," she said. But inside South Africa, something else was happening. In 1986, Winnie returned to Soweto in defiance of her banning orders. She established what she called the Mandela Football Club, a group of young men who lived in her backyard and acted as her bodyguards. The name suggested sport. The reality was closer to a private militia. The football club degenerated quickly. They became involved in turf wars, torture, abduction. In 1988, they burned down the Mandela family home in Orlando West. The very house that had sheltered the struggle was destroyed by people claiming to act in its name. Then came Stompie Sipe. He was 14 years old, a young activist who had been staying at the Methodist Mission House. In December of 1988, members of the football club took him from the mission. Winnie's associate, Soliswa Falati, claimed the boy was a police spy. He was beaten in Winnie's house. His body was later found stabbed to death in a riverbed. A group called the Mandela Crisis Committee, which included Cyril Ramaphosa, confronted Winnie. They demanded she release other abducted youths. She refused. In February of 1989, the mass democratic movement took the extraordinary step of publicly censuring her. They expressed outrage at Mrs. Mandela's complicity in the assaults. For the liberation movement to turn on the wife of its most sacred symbol was almost unthinkable, but the evidence had become impossible to ignore. Almost impossible. Nelson, isolated in his cell, received fragments of news from visitors. He wrote to Winnie, urging her to get rid of these people around you. It is poor judgment to have them near you. But publicly, he stood by her. When Bishop Magoba raised concerns, Mandela told him simply, "She's a wonderful girl." His prison letters reveal something painful. He wrote to her with desperate, romantic longing, dreaming of domestic scenes that bore no resemblance to her actual life. He kept a photograph of a woman from National Geographic in his cell, because her body reminded him of Winnie's. He was in love with a memory, a woman who had ceased to exist years before. Winnie had moved on. She had begun a relationship with Dali Mpofu, a young lawyer 27 years her junior. She wrote letters to Mpofu complaining that she hadn't spoken to Tata in months. In 1982, she told a journalist, "Nelson is 63 now, and I am still like a young girl, still longing for the experience of married life." The Free Mandela campaign had succeeded beyond anyone's dreams. He was a global messiah, a symbol of freedom worshipped on concert stages in London and New York. But the man himself was increasingly powerless. He could not control the violent populism being unleashed in his name. He could not reach the wife who had become a stranger. The myth of Mandela had never been stronger. The marriage had never been weaker. Chapter 10. Tea with the Enemy. In March of 1982, without warning, Mandela was moved. He and three of his closest comrades, Sisulu, Mlaba, and Mlangeni, were transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. Their new home was a single large cell the guards called Room 99. It had a roof terrace where they could feel the sun, but no view of the earth below. The walls were damp. The air sat heavy in the lungs. Mandela caught a chill that would linger in his chest for years, eventually blooming into tuberculosis. But the food improved. Meat and vegetables arrived on their plates daily, a small mercy after the sparse rations of the island. 2 years passed before the government granted him something he had almost forgotten was possible. In 1984, Winnie was allowed a contact visit. They could finally touch. Warder James Gregory, understanding the weight of the moment, turned his gaze tactfully toward the window, while husband and wife held each other for the first time in over a decade. The following January, President P.W. Botha made Mandela an offer. He could walk free if he renounced violence. Mandela refused. His daughter Zinzi read his reply aloud to a packed stadium in Soweto. The words echoed across the country and around the world. Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts. And yet, even as he rejected the government's terms, Mandela was already thinking several moves ahead. In 1985, he made a decision that would have stunned his comrades had they known. He initiated secret contact with the apartheid regime. He told no one. He reasoned that there are times when a leader must move out ahead of his flock, even at the risk of being seen as a traitor. The first meeting came in December of that year. Mandela was recovering from prostate surgery in a hospital ward when Justice Minister Kobe Coetzee walked in. Mandela greeted him with the warmth of an old friend. "Ah, Mr. Coetzee, how nice to see you." Coetzee, who had expected defiance, was disarmed. He later remarked on Mandela's old-world values, his politeness, his patrician ease. After that, Mandela was returned to Pollsmoor, but placed in a separate section on the ground floor, 3 rooms away from his comrades. The arrangement was designed to make future meetings easier. His friends upstairs were furious when they found out, but Mandela insisted the isolation was necessary. He was playing a longer game now. Warrant Officer Gregory began taking him on secret drives around Cape Town. Mandela saw the ocean. He saw the suburbs. He saw the extraordinary wealth and ease that white South Africans enjoyed. The swimming pools and garden parties. The world that had flourished while he broke limestone on Robben Island. The country had changed in ways he could not have imagined from inside a cell. Between 1988 and 1989, Mandela held 47 secret meetings with a government committee that included intelligence chief Neil Barnard. They argued about the armed struggle, about communism, about what majority rule would actually look like. The conversations were careful, probing. neither side fully trusted the other. Then, in 1988, the tuberculosis finally caught up with him. He was hospitalized, his lungs rattling, his body weakened. When he recovered, he was not returned to a cell. Instead, he was moved to a private bungalow at Victor Verster prison. It had a swimming pool. He used it with a body board, never having learned to swim properly. A personal cook named Jack Swart prepared his meals. The cage was gilded now, but it was still a cage. Even with staff at his disposal, Mandela insisted on washing his own dishes. He made his own bed. Small rituals of dignity maintained in a place designed to strip him of it. In March of 1989, he wrote a 10-page memorandum to Botha, trying to break the deadlock. The government kept demanding the ANC renounce violence before any talks could begin. Mandela argued this was a non-starter. You cannot ask one side to disarm, while the other keeps its boot on their neck. 4 months later, he was smuggled into the presidential office at Tuinhuis for tea with Botha himself, the man they called the Great Crocodile. Mandela wore a new suit. His prison commander had knotted his tie for him. Mandela had refused to do it himself. He would not meet the president, he said, in a hangman's noose. The meeting was unexpectedly cordial. Botha poured the tea himself. They spoke of Afrikaner history, of the Boer War, of suffering and survival. But when it came to policy, Botha offered nothing. He would not release the other political prisoners. A month later, Botha was gone. A stroke, then a palace coup by his own cabinet. His replacement was F.W. de Klerk, a Conservative Party man whom Mandela initially dismissed as unremarkable. Their first meeting in December of 1989 was businesslike. De Klerk listened. He took notes. But there was no warmth, no charm offensive, just two men measuring each other across a table. Mandela asked for a gesture of good faith. Release Sisulu and the other Rivonia trialists. Let me see that you mean it. In October, they walked free. Mandela remained alone in his bungalow, the last piece on the board. Chapter 11. Walking Free. The 2nd of February 1990, F.W. de Klerk stood before Parliament in Cape Town, holding a speech he had written himself. He unbanned the African National Congress. He unbanned the Communist Party. And he announced that Nelson Mandela would be released unconditionally after 27 years behind bars. De Klerk wanted it done quickly. He proposed releasing Mandela straight to Johannesburg that very week, if possible. But Mandela refused. He wanted Cape Town, and he wanted time to prepare. They settled on Sunday, the 11th of February, 9 days to get ready for a world that had been waiting decades. A national reception committee formed to manage the chaos. Its leader was Cyril Ramaphosa, a trade unionist who had never actually met Mandela in person. Ramaphosa was determined to treat him as a disciplined member of the movement. There would be no Messiah worship. The organization came first. That was the line, anyway. At 14 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. He held Winnie's hand. He punched his fist into the air. The cameras of the world were rolling. He wore a slate-grey suit, and to those who hadn't seen him in nearly 3 decades, he looked surprisingly old, thin. The photographs from the 60s showed a boxer in his prime. This man had silver hair and careful steps. The motorcade to Cape Town dissolved into pandemonium almost immediately. Crowds swamped the vehicles. People pressed against the windows, reaching, shouting, weeping. The driver began to panic. The car was trapped for hours in what one observer called the crushing enthusiasm of the mob. Mandela had spent 27 years in relative silence. Now he couldn't move 10 feet without being engulfed by joy. He was meant to deliver a speech from the balcony of City Hall. The crowd below had been waiting for hours, growing restless in the Cape Town heat. When Mandela finally arrived, he discovered a problem. He had left his reading glasses back at the prison. Winnie handed him her pair, and he put them on, peering down at the typescript. The speech was deliberately militant. He opened by saying he stood before them as a humble servant of the people. He reaffirmed the armed struggle, stating that the factors which necessitated it still existed. This was a calculated choice. MK hardliners like Chris Hani were watching closely, worried that the old man had been co-opted during those long years of secret talks. Mandela needed them to know he hadn't gone soft. Margaret Thatcher, watching from London, was disappointed. Old ritual phrases, she called it. But Mandela wasn't speaking to Downing Street. He was speaking to the militants in the townships, to the young comrades who had grown up throwing stones at armored vehicles while he sat in a prison bungalow with a swimming pool. That night, he returned to Soweto. He insisted on staying at the modest 4-roomed house in Orlando West, number 8115, the same house he had lived in before his arrest. Security teams were horrified. The location was indefensible, but Mandela wanted to reconnect with his roots, even if only for a few nights. The symbolism mattered. The country he had returned to was bleeding. In Natal province, a vicious war raged between the ANC-aligned United Democratic Front and Chief Buthelezzi's Inkatha Freedom Party. Zulu nationalists against the liberation movement. Neighbors killing neighbors. Mandela wanted to meet Buthelezi immediately, to throw their weapons into the sea, as he put it. But ANC hardliner Harry Gwala blocked the meeting. He argued it would look like appeasement. In March, police opened fire on demonstrators in Sebokeng. 12 people died. Mandela suspended talks with the government in protest, telling de Klerk to stop the slaughter. He embarked on an international tour, visiting 49 countries in the first 2 years of his freedom. In New York, he received a ticker-tape parade. People called him a modern-day Moses. The world wanted to celebrate, even as the townships burned. Back home, he learned the full extent of the violence committed by Winnie's bodyguards. The Mandela Football Club had terrorized Soweto. He instructed her to disband the group, but when she faced trial for kidnapping, he stood beside her publicly. Whatever was happening in their marriage, he would not abandon her in court. In August 1990, Mandela forced the ANC to suspend the armed struggle. The Pretoria Minute, they called it. The rank and file were furious. Many felt betrayed. But Mandela understood that without this concession, negotiations would collapse entirely. Evidence mounted that state security forces were secretly funding Inkatha. Death squads prowled the townships at night. Mandela accused de Klerk of permitting a double agenda, talking peace in the conference rooms while waging war in the streets. The initial rapport between the two men evaporated. Mandela told de Klerk he had blood on his hands. Chapter 12. Saving the Peace. The negotiations began badly. At the first plenary session of the Convention for a Democratic South Africa in December 1991, de Klerk launched an unexpected attack. He accused the ANC of maintaining Umkhonto we Sizwe in secret, suggested they could not be trusted to negotiate in good faith. The delegates shifted in their seats. Mandela sat rigid, his jaw tight. He had thought they had an understanding. The D.F. Mallan Accord had been signed. Commitments had been made in private. And now, on live television, de Klerk was making him look like a liar. When Mandela took the podium to respond, the patrician calm was gone. In its place was fury, cold and controlled. He declared that even as the head of an illegitimate minority regime, de Klerk should be expected to uphold certain moral standards. He called him less than frank. He said he would only surrender weapons to an elected government, not one where security forces did precisely what the president wanted them to do. And if de Klerk continued to act in bad faith, Mandela warned he would see to it that it stopped. They shook hands the next day. It meant nothing. De Klerk would later write that the outburst created a rift between them that never again fully healed. In March 1992, de Klerk held a whites-only referendum to get a mandate for reform. Vote yes if you are scared of majority rule, the posters read. He won 68.7%. His hand at the table grew stronger, but by May, the talks had collapsed entirely. The government demanded 75% majorities for any constitutional changes, which amounted to a permanent minority veto. The ANC offered 70. Neither would budge. The ANC walked out and launched rolling mass action, a wave of strikes and protests that swept across the country. Then came Boipatong. On June 17, 1992, Inkatha supporters, aided by police, entered the township and killed 38 people. When Mandela arrived at the scene, the crowd held up signs. No peace. Do not talk to us about peace. Please, Mr. Mandela, no peace. Give us weapons. He listened, and then he snapped back. I am your leader, he told them. As long as I am your leader, I will tell you always when you are wrong. If you are going to kill innocent people, you do not belong to the ANC. Inside the movement, the radicals were pushing hard. Ronnie Kasrils wanted what he called the Leipzig option, mass insurrection, an uprising that would topple the Bisho homeland government in Ciskei. In September, marchers moved on Bisho. Ciskei troops opened fire, 28 dead, 200 wounded. Mandela understood. Mass action had limits. The strategy had walked them to the edge of a cliff, and they had looked over. He opened a secret channel to de Klerk. By September 26th, they had signed the Record of Understanding. The deal banned what were called cultural weapons, the spears and clubs that Inkatha carried, and required the fencing of migrant hostels where attackers had staged. Chief Buthelezi was furious. His alliance with the National Party had been broken. Joe Slovo, the old communist, had proposed what he called a strategic retreat. The ANC would offer power sharing for a fixed period and guarantee that white civil servants would keep their jobs. It was a way to avoid a counter-revolution, to give the old order a soft landing so they would not burn the house down on the way out. Then Chris Hani was killed. On April 10, 1993, a Polish immigrant shot the popular ANC leader in his driveway. A right-wing conservative member of parliament had plotted the assassination. Riots erupted across the country. 70 people died in the following days. The country stood at the edge of a race war, and it was Mandela, not President de Klerk, who addressed the nation on television. A white man, full of prejudice and hate, came to our country and committed a deed so foul that our whole nation now teeters on the brink of disaster, he said. But a white woman, of Afrikaner origin, risked her life so that we may know and bring justice to the assassin. De Klerk admitted later that it was Mandela's moment, not his. Moral authority had shifted. The white right-wing generals were still threatening war. General Constant Viljoen, head of the Afrikaner Volksfront, commanded tens of thousands of trained men. Mandela invited him to tea in August. He did not bluff. "If you want to go to war," he told Viljoen, "we cannot stand up to you on the battlefield. But you cannot win because of our numbers, and you cannot kill us all." Then he praised Afrikaners as freedom fighters who had resisted the British Empire. Viljoen agreed to participate in the elections. At the final negotiating session in November, Mandela intervened personally to force de Klerk to abandon the minority veto in the cabinet. He could not run a government in such a fashion, he insisted. The interim constitution was agreed. A 5-year government of national unity, job security for white soldiers and police, amnesty for political crimes. The ANC won 62.6% of the vote in April 1994. Mandela became the first black president, with de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki as his deputies. Chapter 13. The Rainbow President. On May the 10th, 1994, the world watched South Africa inaugurate its first black president. Mandela stood before the crowd at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, the same seat of power that had orchestrated decades of oppression. He quoted the Afrikaans poet Ingrid Jonker. "The child is not dead," he said, "not at Langa, nor at Nyanga." It was a deliberate choice, folding Afrikaner culture into the fabric of this new nation before the cement had even dried. He declared that the time for healing had come, and pledged to build what he called a rainbow nation, at peace with itself and the world. The gestures came quickly after that. He retained Derek Keyes, de Klerk's finance minister. He kept Chris Stahls at the Reserve Bank. He appointed the conservative Chris Liebenberg to handle the nation's money. ANC radicals grumbled that he was leaning too far toward the old guard. Mandela pressed on regardless. He invited the wives and widows of former apartheid leaders to tea at the presidential residence, a place called Genadendal, which translates to Valley of Mercy. Among them sat Betsy Verwoerd, 94 years old, widow of the architect of apartheid himself. When she forgot her glasses and stumbled through her speech, Mandela gently prompted her through it. He visited the statue of Boer war hero Daniel Theron and laid a wreath, telling onlookers that his own life as a freedom fighter had been deeply influenced by Afrikaner freedom fighters. Then came the rugby. The 1995 Rugby World Cup became the zenith of his symbolic presidency. The Springboks had long been a hated emblem for black South Africans, a team that represented everything the old regime had cherished. Mandela walked onto the field at Ellis Park, wearing a Springbok jersey, number 6, the captain's number. Before the final, he told a crowd in Soweto, "You see this cap I am wearing? This cap does honor to our boys. I ask you to stand by them because they are our kind." While Mandela handled the symbols, Thabo Mbeki ran the government. Mandela said as much to journalists in London in 1997. The ruler of South Africa, the de facto ruler, is Thabo Mbeki. I am shifting everything to him. Economic policy shifted toward a neoliberal strategy called GEAR. Mandela had attended the World Economic Forum in Davos and been impressed by how warmly the business crowd received de Klerk and Buthelez's pro-market stance. He endorsed privatization soon after. At home in Houghton, he lived simply. He made his own bed every morning. He folded his pajamas. He donated a third of his presidential salary to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. The government of national unity strained under the weight of old resentments. In January of 1995, Mandela publicly humiliated de Klerk in a cabinet meeting over the question of police indemnity, unleashing what witnesses described as a tirade. De Klerk nearly resigned on the spot. He left the government the following year, in May of 1996. Their relationship remained cold. Mandela resented having to share the Nobel Peace Prize with a man he believed had turned a blind eye to what was called third force violence during the transition. He could be hard on allies too. He dismissed Bantu Holomisa, a deputy minister, for alleging corruption against another minister. Mandela valued loyalty to the ANC hierarchy over whistleblowing. When Archbishop Desmond Tutu criticized MPs' salary hikes publicly, Mandela rebuked him, saying he should have raised the matter in private rather than creating the impression of division. His foreign policy was driven by human rights, but tangled in old loyalties. He defended arms sales to Syria. He maintained ties with Gaddafi and Castro, stating plainly that the enemies of countries in the West were not his enemies. In 1995, he tried to intervene in Nigeria, pleading with General Abacha not to execute the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa. When Abacha did it anyway, Mandela called him an insensitive and frightened dictator, but he failed to rally African support for sanctions. He was hurt and angry. There were successes too. He brokered the Lockerbie deal, persuading Gaddafi to hand over the Libyan suspects for trial in exchange for lifting UN sanctions. It was a major diplomatic coup. But in 1998, He ordered the invasion of Lesotho to prevent a coup, and the operation was poorly planned. Rioting and arson broke out in Maseru, a rare blunder. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission under Desmond Tutu. When the ANC tried to block the final report because it accused them of human rights abuses, Mandela intervened to endorse it. "I am the president," he said. "I approve of everything they did." By 1999, his government had delivered electricity, water, and houses to millions. Unemployment had also risen. Critics argued he was a figurehead who focused on reconciliation while the economy stalled. Perhaps there was truth in that. Perhaps the symbolic work was the only work that mattered in those fragile first years. Chapter 14. The Final Act. The marriage had been sustained by letters, by distance, by the myth of what they had once been to each other, but myths cannot survive the same bedroom. In April 1992, Mandela announced his separation from Winnie. He spoke carefully, as he always did when the cameras were watching. He parted with no recriminations, he said. He embraced her with all the love and affection he had nursed for her across those long years. The words were gracious. The estrangement was permanent. The letters to Dalim Pofu, which had been whispered about for years, were finally used in court. The press published them hungrily. She complained she hadn't spoken to Tata in 5 months. She detailed how she had funneled ANC welfare funds to support the affair. The private humiliation became public spectacle. Mandela filed for divorce in 1996. In court, he said something that silenced the room. "Ever since I came back from jail, not once has the defendant entered the bedroom whilst I was awake." He paused. "I was the loneliest man in the world when I stayed with her." Winnie contested everything. She demanded a settlement based on traditional custom. Mandela's response was measured but firm. "I respect custom, but I am not a tribalist. Custom is not moribund." He paid her 3 million rand and her legal costs. The marriage that had been sustained by myth and distance for decades was finally, legally, over. And then, something unexpected. Happiness. Her name was Graça Machel. She was the widow of Samora Machel, the Mozambican president who had died in a plane crash. She was 27 years younger than Mandela. She was intelligent, accomplished, and had no interest in being defined by anyone else. He courted her persistently. She resisted at first. She had built her own life, her own legacy, and she feared losing herself in his enormous shadow. But Mandela was patient. He had learned patience in a lime quarry. He had learned it staring at the walls of a cell. He could wait. Eventually, she relented. "He cares about the little things in life," she said later. "He's so easy to love." They married on his 80th birthday, July 18th, 1998. The wedding was private, but it carried its own public symbolism. Kaiser Matanzima, the nephew who had once served the apartheid system as a homeland leader, attended. A praise singer hailed the unity of the Thembu nation. Old wounds, if not healed, were at least acknowledged. The following year, Mandela stepped down as president. 1 term. He had served one term and walked away. For African leaders, this was almost unheard of. He joked about it. "I don't want a country like ours to be led by an octogenarian." He retired to Kunu, to the hills where he had once herded cattle as a boy. But the house he built there was strange. It was a replica of the bungalow at Victor Verster prison, the cottage where he had spent his final years of captivity. He preferred its familiar layout to grander designs. Perhaps the man who had spent 27 years in prison had grown accustomed to certain walls. Retirement did not mean silence. In December 1999, he became the facilitator for the Burundi peace process. He was 71 years old and tired, but he still had moral authority to spend. He used it bluntly. "You do not compromise with a friend," he told the delegates. "You compromise with an enemy." He invited Bill Clinton and other world leaders to raise the stakes. He secured an accord in August 2000 through sheer force of personality, though the war would grind on. He became a vocal campaigner against HIV and AIDS, publicly regretting his own government's slow response. He admitted he had been reticent to discuss sex. His generation's conservatism had made him cautious, and that caution had cost lives. When President Mbeki embraced AIDS denialism, Mandela pushed back. He visited HIV-positive activists like Zaki Ahmad. He embraced them for the cameras to force the government to provide antiretrovirals. In January 2005, his last surviving son, Makgatho, died. The cause was AIDS. Mandela announced it publicly, deliberately, to fight the stigma that kept so many silent. He had buried his mother while on Robben Island. He had buried his eldest son, Thembi, without being allowed to attend the funeral. Now, he buried Makgatho, and he did it with the cameras watching, because even grief could be made useful. He told an anecdote in his later years about a tourist in the Bahamas. The man had approached him and asked, quite earnestly, "What are you famous for?" Mandela found this funny. He expressed hope that when he died, people wouldn't have to ask. He rejected the Messiah label to the end. "I was an ordinary man who became a leader because of extraordinary circumstances," he said. "My greatness is a creation of the collective imagination." He meant it. The man who had crafted his own legend understood, perhaps better than anyone, that legends are collaborative fictions. The long walk was finally over. The boy from the Transkei Hills, the boxer from Soweto, the prisoner on the island, the president in the Springbok jersey. He left behind a country that was free but fractured, a democracy built on a miracle he had personally engineered. But as the world mourned the saint, what remained was the man, the one who made his own bed, who loved and lost, who, in the end, simply wanted to be remembered as someone who did his duty